Good evening or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And I mean that, ladies and gentlemen. Let's all be ladies and gentlemen out there with everything going on around us and around the world. We talk about this. I've had some, I guess, spiritual people and some consciousness people on the show to try to make sense out of making sense out of yourself and being a stronger you. And that's what's important, is to make yourself strong, kind, forgiving, and then go from there. But if you have to do anything, then you have to do it, and you'll know it. It's when God tells you what's going on. And but no, I pray to God about this allergy. it, it just doesn't want to let up. I don't know what that is. Chemtrails? Did I say that? Chemtrails. Oh, this is just for entertainment purposes only. Okay. But no, I have a guest, and he's from the UK, and we had a little talk before the show, and I always like to talk to my guests a little bit before a show to find out where they want to go with things and where they don't want to go with things. And I know where they don't want to go. So what we're doing is we're back to UFOs today. I know the last week or two we've been off into other spiritual matters and consciousness and that type of thing, but that's all part of this UFO phenomenon. It's consciousness, spirituality, and I felt spirituality with my abductions in the past. So it's all, a mess of everything. If you can't take away the psychological effect of humans or the ETs, what they're up to and what they want and what they're doing. You can't take that part of it away. The mechanical part of seeing a UFO and actually meeting a ET or being abducted, that's more or less the physical part of it. But there's more to it. There's a consciousness matter that goes along with it, and that's why I've been having shows with people who are into spirituality and energy healing, in which we need right now. My guest from UK tonight on this show is Nigel Watson. Has researched and investigated historical and contemporary reports of UFO sightings since the 1970s. He writes a regular monthly column, Saucers of the Damned, about UFOs for 14 Times magazine. He has regular contributed to the Magonia, all about space, Outer Limits magazine, Fate, Flying Saucer Review, and a UFO magazine, and is the author of UFOs of the First War. That's going to be interesting. The UFO Investigations Manual, that's another book that's, I can imagine he's compiled a lot of information on that one, and Captured by the Aliens, the Betty and Barney Hill, mostly in that book. A history and analysis of American abduction claims, which is dedicated to the memory of Peter Rogerson and has a foreword by him. His next book is Portraits of Alien Encounters Revisited, that should come out later this year. And that's in 2024, I would imagine, right, Nigel?
It's going to be July next year now.
Okay, next year. Okay.
It's all prepared, but it's going to take a while before it goes through the publishing process.
Yeah, I know all about that.
Slow.
It could be, yeah, it could be laborious too. With Jenny Randalls, he has contributed to and provided commentary to a selection of 14 Times articles in the UFO files. And okay, and you're in the UK. Tell us, Nigel, about what you studied and what you're up to today. And we just talked about your book that's coming out next year. So and we're going to be talking about these other three books during this our program. Tell us a little bit about yourself that it might have been missing from my bio entry, and also tell us what you're up to.
All right. Well, I first became interested in UFOs in the late 1960s, and it was mainly inspired by the Apollo Moon project. And I was inspired by the fact that we could actually go to another celestial body. So when I saw UFO books, I thought, well, if we can get to the moon with our existing technology, it does seem logical that aliens who had got to a technological stage thousands of years ago would easily be able to produce spaceships and visit us. So it seemed a kind of logical progression to look at the space program and then to see that UFOs could be spaceships. And I think a lot of people got interested in that idea in the late 60s because, you know, space exploration was in the headlines nearly every week and everything. And also there were books like Chariots of the Gods by Erich von Däniken. And so ideas about ETs visiting us seemed a pretty logical idea. It was kind of laughed at in the 1950s with the American contactees, people like Daniel Fry and George Adamski, and their tales were thought to be kind of rather outlandish. But by the sort of early 1970s, when I really got interested in UFOs, were people like John Keel writing about all sorts of strange UFO encounters, and he disputed the idea that there were, you know, extraterrestrials in sort of nuts and bolts spacecraft. And he and other writers like Jacques Vallée as well also opened up the idea that UFOs and aliens aren't much different from fairy folk and will-o'-the-wisp and sightings back in history, you know, right back to biblical times, which links with Chariots of the Gods in a way. But we've become the idea that, you know, UFOs and aliens have been part of human experience for you know, literally hundreds of years, rather than just something that occurred in 1947. I think with 1947, it was the term flying saucer gave an umbrella terminology, really. It gives something to hang all these ideas on. Just as like nowadays with UAP, it's brought a new range of ideas about disclosure and non-terrestrial craft and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
So I think in a way,
yeah, Nigel,
sorry.
I want to ask you a question, a couple of questions, I guess, before we continue on the, and strange reality was Dave Emmons. I don't think I verbally said that. So getting old, whatever. No, Nigel, I asked my writers and my guests that are writers and also investigators, have you had a UFO or ET encounter yourself?
Not at all, no. I've had I've seen odd lights in the sky, which I found it hard to explain.
Mm.
And I always tell a story of seeing something very impressive not long after Close Encounters came out. I was in Warminster, which is a hotspot of UFO activity in Britain in the 1960s. And it still has a bit ticks over as a sort of UFO hotspot, but you know, generally it's died off now. But I was a passenger in a car in a country lane at night, and we suddenly stopped because we saw these lights in the sky a few fields away. But it seemed like a classic flying saucer, but it was an advertising airship. And when it came closer, you could hear the engines going. So we knew it was something terrestrial. But what was interesting about it was that it was so powerful, you know, to see something kind of large and bright in the distance. Even though it had an explanation, there's still that impact it has on you. So if it was something we couldn't have explained, you know, it would have perhaps had a more long-lasting impact on my beliefs than that. Because I've tended to become quite, you know, skeptical about a lot of cases, but I think it just shows the power of what just a few lights in the sky can have on your imagination. And I think some people can be perhaps impacted more by what they see in the sky or experiences. And perhaps, you know, some people would say they're more in tune with, you know, the paranormal and things.
Mm.
And that's the thing, even with UAP research now, there's this kind of I suppose it's a spectrum of going from seeing a light in the sky through to meeting aliens or
Yeah.
having messages or to being abducted. So there is an O scale, and some people go through that O spectrum,
Right.
and others might just see a light in the sky and,
Well,
not.
actually, a lot of contactees, we call them people who have more than one event
Mm,
in their life. And that's been me also. And I'm a contactee, but we we think when we look up at the sky, we don't pay much attention to the orb so much, that's flying around
no,
up there. At least I don't. I've
no,
I've seen them up close. I've seen five, six of them actually, and I've seen them up close, so I know what they look like, and I know what a real one looks like, and I don't pay much attention to the orbs. Louis Alessandro, you know him. He's with the Pentagon. He's investigating
yeah.
UFO UAP encounters. He had an interesting. He was on a show the other night. And it's a credible show. But he said that there could be a possibility that most of these UFOs and ETs come right from Earth, right here,
Mm,
and they have bases underground, and they fly, and around, and they go back into their bases. He made that comment, and he knows a little bit about what's going on because he's had some top secret, I guess meetings and things of that nature. But that's something that I know there are some that's coming from Earth, but there's also some that's coming from out in space. They come through wormholes and portals. That's how they travel. Some scientists say, well, how are they going to get 14, 15 light years from us here? Uh,
yeah.
that so it's wormholes and portals. That's how they travel. And there's actually I've seen some actual videos of these craft coming through like wormholes that look like little tornadoes in the sky. We're going to talk about this, I guess, Nigel. Let's see, the Nigel Watson UFOs of the First World War, and what do you call it? Phantom airships, balloons, aircraft, and uh, I'll have to read that, and other mysterious aerial phenomena. Is it were the craft in the World War One, were they buzzed by these light, what they call them? That they were buzzed by them in World War Two, actually. Uh,
Yeah.
uh, Foo Fighters, something like that. They call them Foo Fighters. But now tell us about this book of the First World War, and why did you write it? There must be a lot of activity going on, Nigel.
Yeah. It came from in the 1970s. I started looking into local newspaper archives because writing for 14 Star Times had just about started in the 70s, and that sort of praised the work of Charles Fort, who wrote The Book of the Damned. And in Charles Fort's books, there are references to phantom airships being seen in 1909 over Britain. So I looked through old newspapers in my local newspaper files and found similar reports to the ones found by Charles Fort. And then I was in contact with Granville Oldroyd, a researcher who lived in Lancashire, and David Clark, who lived in Sheffield. And they also did similar newspaper research. So we kind of gathered all this material together and realized there were literally hundreds of reports in the newspapers of mainly lights in the sky. Although in 1909, the first sort of sighting was in March when a police constable in Peterborough saw, I think he saw a light and a shape of an object and heard the sound of engines. And this story, it kind of lay dormant until more people saw things a bit later in the year. Then his story came out. Uh, but a lot of sightings were just lights in the sky, but some were of structured objects, and some people imagine they might have seen the pilot in the framework beneath an airship. And what's interesting, a lot of these sightings were in East Anglia or in South Wales, where people feared invasion from Germany, and Germany had constructed a massive fleet of Zeppelins in that period. So it seemed logical that the Germans might be spying out the land in preparation for an invasion. But flying a Zeppelin over Britain at night with just a searchlight wouldn't have really revealed much. It'd be easier just to spy out the land in daylight, and
Right. Yeah.
and so a lot of sightings perhaps were caused by that excitement. I think a lot of sightings were of Venus or celestial objects, and also even with the first sighting in Peterborough, it kind of got debunked because locals were sending up hot air balloons and and kites with candles on attached to them,
Right. Like
and
Chinese balloons or whatever the,
yeah, that
yeah.
sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
No.
even then you got hoaxers to mix it up, and
Yeah.
then some people said the sound of the engines from the airship were from the local co-op shop or something. So there's a debunking them, but that was a very good sighting, and I think somebody in Peterborough's doing a load of research on this. So a future Fortean Times should spell out a bit better the story. But the I think another really good case that Charles Fort mentions is a Mr. Lethbridge, who was a Punch and Judy man who had a little cart, and he'd presented a Punch and Judy show, and he was traveling over Caerphilly Mountain at night with his little hand cart, and he said he saw a landed balloon with two Germans because they spoke in a guttural language which he didn't understand, and we had fur coats. And when they saw him, they jumped into the basket of a balloon and immediately flew away. And they said it had like two electric lights on it or something. And he told the newspaper office, he went to a local newspaper office the next day, and they went up to investigate the site, and they found plough marks in the ground, and they found lots of litter and news clippings about future war and war with Germany, and they found some little tire valves as well, which might have had foreign labels on. But some of these things, is sort of trivial sort of litter, but stuff associated with an airship. So it seems also people, I think at Cardiff docks, also saw lights in the sky about the same time. But so I suppose in terms of modern day language, it would have been a close encounter of a third kind. But it's difficult really, because some people say it might have been a hoax, but it was quite elaborate because he would have had to make the plough marks, and it would have took a lot of work really. And I think people didn't have a lot of leisure time for messing about really. If you're doing Punch and Judy shows and coming home at night, you haven't
Now,
really got the
it,
ability to do that.
so in
But
World War One, we had people spreading disinformation and
yeah,
trying to, I guess, they're skeptics, or the government might even
yeah,
are trying to tell them, let's debunk these UFO sightings and just say that they're
yeah.
military. Is that what you found in a lot of your investigations, Nigel?
There was lots of reports that were collected by the local police constabulary that were passed on to, I think it was a department of MI6, and they had a couple of officers that looked at all these reports, because obviously if there's fears that, in particular in Northern England and Scotland, there were very real fears that the Germans might have been operating aircraft from a remote location. And they even sent out Boy Scouts and soldiers to search the Lake District to look for one of these bases. And, a lot of people kind of reported these things, but we could never really pin down any base. And when when most of them were investigated, they did have mundane explanations, just like you have today. And in fact, the military intelligence actually produced something like a 16-page document on how to investigate these cases, talking to the witness, finding what direction it was seen. It's just like how you'd investigate a UFO report now. And that was back in 1914, 1915 period. So
Wow.
we obviously were concerned about this. And there were stories about motorists at night using the headlights to signal to Zeppelins, and stories of people on hilltops flashing, flashing lights in the sky to direct Zeppelins. But often we tried tracking these down, but a lot of them were kind of rumors. It's a bit frustrating. There's literally hundreds of reports in the Ministry of Defence files, but very few of them are really anything you can pin down to more than a light in the sky or a vague shape of an aircraft. There were a few incidents of the Royal Flying Corps actually trying to intercept one of these lights, and one of the pilots actually shot at one with that, and he said the the craft looked like a railway carriage with lights lit up, and that one wasn't explained. And there was another tragic case of a light being seen over London, and they sent a spotter in a tethered airship up, and he fell out of a basket of a balloon. So you could say that was an early death by UFO, really. It's
Wow.
rather tragic, looking for these things. But obviously, it's something we didn't want publicized to the newspapers, but these things circulated by word of mouth and were reported to local police constables and police stations. So, and this also happened. The United States, there were several rumors of aircraft flying around. I think in 1916, there's rumors of espionage in ammunition factories and things, DuPont Chemical Works. Canada also had a scare about mystery flyers over there, Ottawa, and I think we even had a blackout so that we could, to try and avoid the aircraft being there to see them. And we even
Nigel,
had,
yeah,
sorry.
you started in 1970. First question, what got you involved in doing the research for all this and also going into World War One? I'm kind of fascinated by this World War One information that you're giving, because here in the US, we didn't have a civilian MUFON or UFO group or
I,
well, it sounds like to me you were early on, what, 1910, that people were watching the skies for UFOs
yeah,
and you were ahead
trying
of
to,
us. You were ahead of us because we had sightings, like out west where it hit a windmill and
yeah.
stuff. We had those types of sightings. And some of the cowboys said they saw these big birds and they shot at them and they couldn't do nothing to them. But we've had those reports, but nobody's ever developed a group of civilian
Yeah.
MUFON UFO investigators like you guys. It sounds like you guys were active on the ground in 1910. Is that true? And then also, what got you involved in these investigations, Nigel?
I think with the historical ones, I thought, well, it's a bit frustrating. Like I used to collect local sightings, and most of them were lights in the sky or a distant disk, nothing really substantial. So I thought, well, if I looked at the historical files, they won't be contaminated about spaceships and uh, people seeing satellites or aircraft, that sort of thing. But if you do, when I did go back through the files, people did misinterpret, Venus, celestial objects, meteors, There's a lot going on in the sky. If you just stand outside your own back door for a few minutes, you notice things are going on in the sky, you know. And even back then when there weren't any aircraft about, or very rarely, you know, there's meteors or people, you know, hoaxing with lights on balloons and things like that. And if you look, well, I suppose what also inspired me was the American cases in 1896, 97, which John Keel wrote about in Operation Trojan Horse. There was literally thousands of sightings throughout America, and they were very extravagant stories of close encounters, and mainly with people that said were inventors. But like you say, there's no organization researching these things because they were just like novelty stories. And you get the feeling, some people say they were just newspaper fabrications, which is probably true of quite a lot of them. But others, there might have been about, you know, secret inventors who were trying to get a bit of publicity. And you also got a few hoaxers sending up craft, and or people just misinterpreting like a meteor or things like that. But it was a very fertile period, and you can kind of compare it with modern day ufology in America, because it is always sort of rather more extravagant than the British stories, which were mainly of, you know, lights in the sky and that sort of thing. So yeah, I just found it fascinating. And Granville Odroyd did a massive amount of research in the public record offices. He sent me all the information about that. And most of that has gone into UFOs of the First World War. I think for me, writing the book was just a way of collating all this information. And also there were scares in not only in Britain in 1909, but in New Zealand, Australia. There was a later wave in late 1909 in Boston mainly, in the United States, where somebody called Tillinghurst claimed he'd invented this marvelous aircraft. And he said he'd flown almost to the Statue of Liberty, and then he turned round and flew back. And he said he even stayed stationary in the air to, you know, exact repairs. And he was trying to get money to build an aircraft factory. And he had reporters, you know, following him night and day to see where he might be launching this secret aircraft. And literally hundreds of people saw lights in the sky. But I think something that happened in Britain, mainly in 1913, when we had another UFO scare, was it could be triggered by Venus. People would stand out on city streets and look at the sky. And I think there it's perhaps because of crowds and that, you probably got a bit of contagion, really. And also, if you look at a light object long enough in a blank background, you got the autokinetic effect, where your brain interprets a stationary object as moving if you've got no other reference points. But it's all very fascinating because it shows you how things happen in modern day UFO waves, where you get localized scares, or you get massive rumors around places like Roswell. And, you know, it's not a modern thing at all. And I think that's the thing with all this UAP thing, is that it's been rebranded, but it's nothing new. And I think that's why a lot of people are quite skeptical of Alonso, not just his claims, but he has helped bring about all these new research projects. But I think people are sort of not frightened, but from past experience, I think we're just going to come out with the same reports Project Blue Book come out with, you know, and that Oh yeah, 99% of UFOs are
Right.
explainable. Then the 1% is unexplained, but it's not the unexplained ones aren't of interest to science or anything like that.
But
So
Alan J. Hynek, he turned around later on and come out and told the truth
yeah,
about a lot of things.
yeah.
Nigel Watson, my guest, Nigel, I've heard of you throughout the years with
Mhm.
UFO investigations. So heard your name around quite a bit. And on this, let's get to the bottom line on this UFOs in the First World War. Now, we're in World War II, and it's funny that also the I guess the Germans are involved in this. Do you think the Germans had technology or back engineered technology, especially in World War II? But did they have it in the First World War? Did they have contact with the
Um,
ETs, Nigel?
um, I don't think so. But the thing is, it's that we felt that they were technologically superior, just like World War II. So there's always this thing about wonder weapons and the enemy having things that we don't have. And Britain was particularly frightened of the German Zeppelins because our navy kind of ruled the world and protected Britain. And our fleet was bigger than the German fleet. There'd been a kind of arms race over who had the biggest dreadnoughts and ships and things. And then in the sky, the Germans built these massive zeppelins, which are far superior to anything we had. And in fact, Winston Churchill, when he was the First Lord of the Admiralty, brought this to the attention of Parliament that there'd been a sighting in um, Sheerness in 1912 at a flying school there. And some of the one of the pilots in particular had a particularly good sighting of a light in the sky and the sound of engines, which was confirmed by some other witnesses there. They never did find out what that was, but there were several rumors that it could have been a German airship. And at that time, there was an actual well-publicized airship flight at the time, but it seems we could never pin down that it actually came over the channel to Britain. So there is a chance that some of these sightings could have been of real German Zeppelin craft.
Mhm.
But I think there it was a fear of technology, and it was the same in the Second World War. There was this fear from the V1 and V2 weapons that Germany might have even more superior weapons up their sleeve. And I think that idea has progressed since the Second World War, where people have said, oh, there's all these secret projects, or this information was passed on secretly to the USA. Um, there's an author back in the 70s, I think he was called William Harbinson. He wrote a book where he believed even back in 1896 there'd been secret German inventors who'd created some UFO craft that were mistaken as airships. And this technology had been passed on secretly right through to the Second World War. But he kind of put it, I think it was more a speculation. I think he actually wrote a fictionalized version of that. But people have tried to connect the dots. But I think anything in ufology, I think it's difficult to actually get firm pinpoints to how you'd actually put that on a real timeline, really, and to sustain such a secret thing. But I think, with, particularly with the Second World War, there's far more, fear of German
Right.
um,
Technology.
technology,
Yeah.
but the
Missile.
food
Yeah.
fighters in particular
Yeah.
were
Yeah.
things.
Nigel, going back to the First World War on your book, uh, we mentioned Foo Fighters. You and I mentioned it earlier on. Now, the World War II pilots, they claimed that, they have pictures of these round, bright balls, and
Yeah.
they call them Foo Fighters. That's not the rock band. The rock band is Foo Fighters, but
Yeah.
There's also Foo Fighters UFOs or UAPs that were in the air in World War II. Did they have any of that in World War One? Were there anything that the pilots saw, military pilots saw in World War One, Nigel?
Yeah, I think they called them oh God, something like flying onions. Were these I did see streams of like lights and things, which were reported by quite a few British pilots, and they thought there was some sort of because the lights were swirling, some thought they were on chains, and that was some sort of secret weapon that would, ensnare the aircraft in these chains. But there were quite a few sightings like that. I think I mentioned it briefly in the book, but I don't know if there's that much more material to find about that because it's obviously by from testimony by pilots in their memoirs and things like that. But I think there's even a bigger story about these flaming onions. That's what we called them, and
Oh,
it's a very good expression, isn't it?
I haven't heard that one before. Really, you're bringing back some real good investigations of World War One. I guess that flaming onion thing is great. I'd have to look. I'm gonna have to look that up too. I know you've done all the investigations, but that's such unique. It's kind of like in World War II they called Foo Fighters. Let's go. Let's move on to time goes by real fast. I'm telling you, Nigel, when you do the show, and but Nigel Watson is my guest, and this is a Strange Reality with Dave Emmons. And I want to get into this other book, UFO Investigations Manual, UFO Investigation from 1892 to the
Mm,
present day. Could you tell
mm.
us a little bit about that book and some of the most fascinating sightings that were seen through that time period, Nigel?
Yeah. This was it's published by Haynes that tends to do motoring manuals and things like that, how to fix your Ford Fiesta or whatever. So they were doing a few different books. So this was a kind of going to be a handbook for kind of ufologists, but rather than as a sort of guide to investigating, I've done it more as a guide to the whole subject itself. So I go from 1892 when there were sightings in what is now called Poland. There's quite a few cross-border sightings of balloons and things. And that was probably one of the earliest sort of um, flap of sightings that was related to balloons, really, and odd lights in the sky. And then I progressed to mentioning the 1896 to 97 American scare. And then I go into look at different elements of a subject. I use Hynek's classification system to look at close encounters of a first, second, third, and after close encounters of a third, you get close encounters of a fifth, which tend to be more spiritual, or I suppose abductions were another subsection of close encounters of a third kind. It's kind of the subject kind of spilt out further since Hynek did his classification. But I also look at Jacques Vallée's classification system, which was slightly different. And I kind of just look at how the subjects moved on and the different investigations like Project Blue Books mentioned. And I also look at things like UFO hotspots and different theories about the subject, are they from outer space? And I wrote it about 10 years ago now, so I'd kind of like to redo it in the light of what's happened in the last 10 years,
There's been a
because
lot. Yeah.
the subject was kind of, I think when that book come out, it did pretty well, but the
Right.
subject kind of had tailed off. And it wasn't until 2017 in the New York Times article about, the Navy videos and things like that. So the last 7 years have really kind of spiked interest in the subject. So even if you're a skeptic, it has kind of renewed well, worldwide interest in the subject, you know.
Right.
So,
Nigel, I know you have this book, Captured by Aliens. And
yeah.
were there any abductions back in 1890 and through World War One as we close that chapter? Was there any abductions reported during those
Well,
times?
well, actually, in 1892, there was this border dispute. I think it was between sort of Poland and Russia or East Germany. I can't remember now, but there was a lot of border tensions, and soldiers saw lights in the sky. And a local mayor was actually abducted in some sort of aircraft, apparently. And you
Hmm.
know, it might have been just I don't know how much validity there was to it, but it's interesting. But even then, there were stories about people being taken away by such things. In the 1896-97, most of the stories are of inventor types who let people look around the craft, but I think sometimes they offer to give the person a flight, but you know, that doesn't actually occur. So I think really the abductions really came um, quite slowly since 1947. There were odd sort of vague rumors and stories about that. I think the Antonio Villas-Boas story, where he said he was on a tractor late at night in Brazil and he got abducted and
Mhm.
he got abducted on board a spaceship and then he had intercourse with a space woman.
Yeah,
And that,
that was
yeah,
the
and
space
that
lady.
famous case,
Yeah.
and that kind of they didn't really want to publicize that case. It was known in America, but it didn't come out until a few years later. And what gave it a bit more credibility is the Betty and Barney Hill case,
Right.
which got investigated by people who were aware of the South American cases. And so, and Betty and Barney Hill came across as very credible witnesses, and especially since they record such strange things under hypnotic regression, that seemed to fit in with the idea that UFOs were monitoring us and they were um, taking biological examinations and samples of human beings, which sounds quite logical, really. But I think ufologists before them preferred to have flying saucers and remote craft. They didn't really want to associate themselves with the contactees and stories of that type. And so it was a slow process before it took a journalist, John Fuller, to actually write a book about them to make it kind of a worldwide impact. Then ufologists kind of followed his footsteps, really.
Right.
And then into the 70s, we got a few more famous abduction cases. But I think it wasn't until Bud Hopkins came along and David Jacobs and John Mack that it really took off in the 80s. I I'm always about 10 years behind every trend, so it wasn't until about 20 years ago that I kind of, once the abduction thing had kind of died off, I kind of got more interested in it. I'd read about it, but I'd not really um, took a great deal of interest in it. So I thought with writing Captured by Aliens, I used the Betty and Barney Hill case to look back at the history of the subject and also to look at all the elements of it. There's a lot of psychological elements. People have said there's things like sleep paralysis and other psychological states that could cause these events. And then there's a kind of evidence that suggests there's something else beyond that. You know, people have scars and scoop marks,
Right.
or they have muddy clothing. Or, you know, so you've got all this about, you know, are they factually true events or are they hyper reality, you know, dreams or nightmares or some people, they also come up with the idea of fantasy proneness. Some people are more prone to believe in fantastic stories or telling fantastic stories. And
Oh, it's more cerebral in a dream type of state
yeah,
that you're talking about. Yeah. Yeah, there has to be something tangible in every story to kind of prove, the beginning point. In abductions, now throughout history, even in antiquity, they got these pictures of flying saucers, behind, I guess they were painted back in the 1300s and 1400s, and they got these antiquity drawings and they show UFOs in there. And there's
mm,
been abductions, even through the biblical process. There's been
yeah,
abductions, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Muhammad in 550. They were abducted, Enoch, and they went to heaven, or went up in a
mm,
fiery craft. So abductions have been with us ever since the ETs have been with us, and I think the ETs have been here on Earth for thousands of years. And
mm,
you go back to the Anunnaki, 60,000 years where they manipulated our DNA. But I think a lot of that, it's just like Louis Alexander will come up with this report about a lot of them are coming from here, right from Earth, from inside
mm,
the Earth and underground. But that abduction process, I think the reason why we know more since 1890 that you're talking about is because we have more cases documented and people
yeah,
they hear more about it. I think that's probably the reason why since then. But that's fascinating about World War One, having the same thing as they did. But now, do you compare anything that happened in World War One to what happened to the pilots in World War Two, like the Foo Fighters that were round balls and they seemed like they were intelligently guided? You,
yeah. I think the flaming onions were about the closest, but some people try to identify it as um, certain anti-aircraft weapons that the Germans were developing, but some of them seemed a bit too, fantastic to have been able to um, be terrestrial things that people saw. Um, it's also interesting, though, that it's the same with the Foo Fighters. None of these strange lights actually damaged aircraft. And I think when the RAF and the United States investigated Foo Fighters, they had lots of quite interesting reports and things, but they never did anything. So we were trying to work out, what these things are chasing aircraft or flying alongside them. And we tried to say, was it a kind of aerial St. Elmo's fire, or I've heard some people would say that in both cases in wartime, that it was just war nerves, people are exhausted, so they're more likely to hallucinate. But these stories did occupy the minds of lots of air crews. In fact, the RAF actually saw these things long before the American pilots, but I think the British pilots had different names. I think the Americans came up with Foo Fighters, but there's several, I think they just called them guided rockets and things like that. So I think you have to have the right terminology, really. It wasn't until flying saucers became a name that everyone saw these discs, literally flying saucers. And then with UAPs, it's a more ambiguous thing, isn't it?
no,
It's an anomalous phenomenon. And also, it's something that moves fast, can go into the sea, and doing fantastic technological things that seem to be way beyond our technology. I think that's one point we should make. Like, we're trying to investigate these things, but I'm skeptical. But if 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 aliens, like I said earlier, were thousands of years ahead of us, we never would get a handle on their technology, would we? It'd be like a First World War pilot trying to understand a supersonic aircraft now, and that's only within 100 years of our own technological advances. So for us to understand anything truly, um, hundreds of thousands of years ago. That's so beyond our own comprehension. And some people would argue things like abductions were presented in a way that we can understand. So the aircraft always have like operating tables and controls like you'd get in Star Trek or something, or but people in the past saw airships, or people saw mystery aircraft, because it was in terms of a technology people at the time could understand. I think people like Jacques Vallée have said, that they're manipulating how they appear so that we can, at the level of what we can understand. And so, but we're always about one step beyond our own technology. Like now, I suppose we consider aliens, like at one time we considered some alien encounters perhaps to be holographic projections.
Yes.
Now people say there might be androids or cyborgs,
Mhm.
or that they're AI craft. So
We would
in a way, yeah,
never know. Us humans would never know what we're encountering. Uh,
yeah,
Now, on this book, this Captured by Aliens, the Betty and Barney Hill uh, abduction, and Kathleen Martin, she's the niece of Betty, and she's done a lot of writing about that, and
yeah.
they're pretty much up on that. And also, you have uh, Travis Walton. Now, excluding those two, what was one of the most fascinating abductions that you have investigated, Nigel?
Um, well, I've investigated some local cases in northern England, and that will be in my book, Portraits of Alien Encounters Revisited. It's a book I wrote and published in 1990, but it's coming out as a revisited next year. And it looks back at the cases I looked at in Northern England, because that's where I was born and brought up. And in the late 1970s, with the release of Close Encounters of a Third Kind, there was a massive amount of newspaper publicity. And Jenny Randalls, who organised Bufora sighting research, she used to send me any local reports in my area. So I just investigate cases that were really high strangeness. And there's one man in particular who said he'd been in contact with space people telepathically, and that one night they'd used an invisible car to carry him to a field, and he could feel himself being teleported up into their craft, but it never quite occurred, and he ended up
Mhm.
back on the ground. But his stories, I think, were quite fantastic, really, and perhaps not as credible as a lot of cases. And for a lot of cases I got, because it was the late 70s, were almost like prototype abductions. When perhaps if a person had been reporting these things later, there might have been, abduction incidents. I think the problem is as well, hypnosis comes into play. So somebody who might just see a light in the sky under hypnosis might be, you know, might imagine they had an abduction experience, because it's a tricky thing using hypnosis really to,
Yeah,
release messages.
because
It's not,
you're planting seeds that grows
yeah,
in people's minds about what's going on with hypnosis. That's one of the things I've heard a lot about, and that some of these people who hypnotize people, they do it kind of wrong. They start off by planting that seed or talking to them. Okay, we're going to talk about this and this and this. Well, you don't tell them anything. All you do is just put them out and then
yeah,
talk to them, open up. Then you talk to them about what you're going to ask them. That is one of the things that I've seen in the past, and a lot of people sometimes don't trust that. But here's a little article here. You have Phantom Airship in East Anglia, and it's a
yeah,
new feature. Search for the fly by night. What is that all about, and when did that take place, Niles?
Well, that's in East Anglia. I think it was after the Peterborough sighting, and people were very worried that airships were coming over East Anglia with a view to invasion. And there's no raft of literature at that time about imaginary invasions. Um, Usually the German invader was disguised under a different name, but people wrote books about imagining how there'd be battles between, say, the British Army and this imaginary, German army, and people imagined, what would be like if we were invaded. And in fact, that genre of fiction led to H.G. Wells writing War of the Worlds, because instead of a German invasion army, he made it into a Martian invasion army and imagined what a sort of War of the Worlds would be like. So in a way, this fear of invasion kind of set a milestone of science fiction and also a milestone of the greatest Hollywood science fiction of the 50s. We always feared invasion. And even now with Elizondo, really, there's that fear of invasion implicit in a lot of what he says. And some people take against that because they think, UFOs or aliens are benevolent. But I think in a way, you have to kind of sell the military threat thing to get things done. That's exactly what Winston Churchill did in 1912. He got Parliament interested in these sightings so that then he could get a bigger budget for anti-aircraft defences and to organise coastal command and things like that, and to develop guns to shoot these things down. And in a way, I suppose with UAPs, there could be terrestrial highly advanced drones, so we'd have to understand how we'd protect ourselves against them. Look at the Chinese spy scare of
Yeah.
only a year or so, but the modern jet fighters can't shoot down, free
Balloon.
floating balloons. So you have to, perhaps it would be better off getting World War One biplanes to shoot them down with now. So,
I think that was on purpose, Nigel, and actually, what I think what they were afraid of back in between 1890 and 1940, between 1890 and 1947, until we started knowing more on the media, I think a lot of people were worried about an alien invasion, and some
yeah,
people still are. But
yeah,
I think a lot of people, there's about half of us that we call awakened, and
mm,
what we see is a false flag that
mm,
could be a UFO and ET invasion that is made up by whomever that's
mm.
trying to do all this stuff around the world. I don't want to get in detail there either, but that that is a plausible situation, isn't it? Have you looked at that, Nigel, the false flag thing with the UFO invasion?
Yeah, I've kind of looked at most angles of the subject, and I think it's a fascinating one because the first flag thing is something people, I think Ronald Reagan spoke about it. If we've all got a common enemy, I think Werner von Braun also brought that up even earlier. That if our nations have got a common enemy of an alien, we'd kind of unite against it, which is probably true, but I think there'd be so many divisions as well. It's something very difficult for us to for any government to kind of manipulate that kind of thing. I suppose a lot of the agenda of a UFO subject is set by the United States, but you got to understand the subject goes beyond the United States. So, you know, Britain and Europe has often been far more skeptical of the claims in America. And so it's harder to have a kind of false flag scenario if other countries, don't believe in that sort of thing, or it's not spread that far. I suppose in a way, it's more in terms of China, Russia, the United States, really, that sort of thing goes on because they're all wary of, have they got, far superior technology than us? And so in a way, you've got to look into those things. I think from a British perspective, we've always gone along with the American viewpoint because we haven't got the resources to look into these things. Our own government, from what the files say, just say, well, we'll just follow like Project Blue Book shut down. We had a similar project sort of in the late 90s where somebody looked into the UFO subject on behalf of the Ministry of Defense, and their conclusion was that most could be explained, but some might be plasma phenomenon that can affect radar and have electromagnetic effects.
Yeah,
But
that's some of my thoughts too. They're using that the energy plasma, that's electrical magnetic energy for their propulsion. Now all like, we're moving up on the hour. So I wanted to ask you, summing up all your investigations and what you've done, and I've heard of your name way back, and I'm just as old as you are, probably older, but I've heard of you way back. But not to make you look old, me look young, but I'm about the same age probably. But what is your final conclusion on UFOs and ETs, Nigel, that you found? What's your gut feelings?
pardon? My gut feeling is I don't have an answer really. I
Yeah.
think it's a bit like the fortune subject. Anything starts um, in a circle. So you can start anywhere on a circle. The subject of UFOs
Mm,
can send you round and round in circles.
right.
And I think sometimes I thought, yeah, it's all rubbish. You can explain everything about. And then you speak to somebody or you look at some other research. You think, how can, that there's no one answer basically. I think there's so many different elements to it. Some of it could be exotic drones of some sort. Others could be psychological phenomena. Others is almost like religious experiences. People I've met have seen UFOs and then had messages from angelic beings, things like that. So, and also people have had demonic experiences feeling very evil. So sometimes, so it's very hard to compartmentalize a subject. It's such a vast spectrum of things. But
Even
that's what makes me interested.
even even myself, I've been through quite a few events, and a lot of synchronicities and paranormal things, and I don't have an answer.
Mm,
Who they are, where they come from, or what are they doing with me? And most abductees or contactees always say, "Why me?" That's one of the questions they
yeah,
ask. So, yeah, we and I hear a lot of people who actually think they have the answer, but
yeah,
I what I do is I take their information and try to piece it together for myself like a puzzle piece, and
yeah.
I try to figure it out from there what I think is the best reason why I've been in contact with them. Uh, why don't you tell us a little bit about where we can find out more about your work, Nigel, and also about your books, where we can get those?
You can look on Facebook. I've got a Facebook page. I think UFO Investigations Manual page on Facebook. But most of my books are on Amazon, and you can you can look me up, Nigel Watson, on Facebook as well.
Right. I've got those sites, and I'll put that in the narrative. And it's yeah, an hour is up already. This is like
Okay.
an hour goes
Goes
fast.
fast.
And I want to thank you so much, Nigel
Okay.
Watson from UK, for being on the show. You've been listening to the Dave Emmons Strange Reality Show with Nigel Watson, and he goes way back in his investigations, and I'm sure he has a lot more he could tell us. But right now it's like 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon for me, but it's about 9 or 10 o'clock for you in the
Mm.
UK. So it's it's sleepy time over there. So, so,
Ready for bed.
so Nigel Watson, thank you so
Okay,
much for being on the show, and
thank you.
good evening or good morning and good
Yeah,
afternoon to everybody else. And thank you so
yeah.
much. Bye bye.